The street where Michael Turner lived was the kind of place people described as ordinary. The lawns were trimmed, the fences freshly painted, and children could often be seen riding bicycles until the evening sun disappeared behind the roofs. Neighbors waved politely when they passed one another, but they never asked too many questions. It was a neighborhood that prized quiet over curiosity, and Michael Turner fit right in. He was the sort of man who attracted no attention at all, which was exactly how he preferred it. He kept his head down, worked a modest job at a hardware store, and returned home each night without anyone noticing when he came or went. At the back of his modest single-story home sat an old wooden shed. Most who glanced at it assumed it was a storage space for gardening tools or maybe an old lawnmower. Its paint was flaking, and a lock on the door was coated in rust. It looked like the kind of structure people eventually forgot existed. Children never dared to go near it, not because they suspected anything dark, but because it had the unwelcoming look of splintered wood and cobwebs. For years, the shed blended into the backdrop of suburban life, ignored and unquestioned. Turner made sure it stayed that way. He would often be seen mowing his lawn in neat lines, clipping the edges with precision, and then retreating toward the shed with something in his hands. The neighbors assumed it was fertilizer, bags of soil, or tools. Nobody ever thought to ask why he spent so much time inside a place that appeared too broken down to be useful. If anyone happened to glance in his direction, he would nod politely and continue on with his task. His ability to appear so unremarkable was his greatest disguise. The house itself revealed nothing about its owner. Curtains were always drawn and lights went out at the same time every night. He received no visitors, no deliveries other than the occasional package, and no friends were ever seen coming or going. Yet no one in the neighborhood felt alarmed by this solitude. In a community where people respected privacy more than they valued connection, Michael was considered a model neighbor, quiet, self-contained, and predictable. Over time, the shed became part of the landscape, just another piece of scenery that no one noticed. It stood under the shade of a leaning oak tree, its roof slightly sagging from years of rain and wind. Even when neighborhood association members raised concerns about property appearances, the shed was never mentioned. It was forgotten as thoroughly as if it had never existed at all. The irony was that this forgotten space held more secrets than anyone could imagine. While families gathered for barbecues, while children laughed and played in sprinklers, and while neighbors sipped iced tea on their porches, the shed sat silently only yards away, containing something that could have shattered the calm of the entire town. The calmness of that street depended on ignorance. Everyone chose to see what was easy to see. Michael Turner relied on that blindness, carefully shaping his life around their lack of suspicion. He knew that as long as he remained invisible in plain sight, no one would ever think to look deeper. His shed with its decaying wood and harmless appearance was the perfect mask. Behind its fragile exterior, hidden from every eye, it was far more than just a place to keep tools. It was the center of a secret that would eventually rip through the community like a storm, but for now it sat unnoticed, guarding its silence as the neighborhood continued to believe in its own safety. The first disappearance seemed like a tragic accident rather than the beginning of something larger. A teenage boy named Daniel was walking home after staying late at school for basketball practice. His friends assumed he had taken a different route, and his parents thought he might have gone to a friend's house. By the time night fell and he had not returned, worry spread through his family, but to the wider community it was simply a missing persons case, the kind that might resolve itself with a phone call or a sheepish return. Flyers were printed, local volunteers combed the streets, and search parties were organized in nearby parks and wooded trails. Despite all the effort, Daniel was never found. Weeks later, when a young woman named Claire vanished on her way home from a late-night shift at the diner, the tone of the town began to change. She had been seen leaving work, her car parked in the lot, but her trail ended on the short drive toward her neighborhood. Detectives searched rivers, abandoned buildings, and open fields, but every lead ended the same way: silence. Families began to whisper among themselves that something more sinister was happening, but without evidence, police could not make those whispers official. In press conferences, officers assured the public they were doing everything they could. Yet their words did little to calm the growing unease. The town had always been a place where people felt safe enough to leave doors unlocked and children played in front yards until long after dark. Now, those same children were kept indoors, and mothers glanced over their shoulders when unloading groceries. Even the hum of routine life began to feel threatening, as if danger might be hiding in the most ordinary places. Each disappearance chipped away at the community's trust in its own streets, and people who had once smiled at one another from their porches now avoided eye contact, each secretly wondering who could be responsible. When a delivery driver named Thomas vanished without completing his route, fear shifted into outright suspicion. His van was discovered on the edge of town, keys still in the ignition, the driver's seat pushed back as though he had stepped out for just a moment. Investigators scoured every inch of the vehicle but uncovered nothing that explained his absence. The town's sense of safety collapsed entirely, and conversations in grocery store aisles or church gatherings always circled back to the same uneasy topic. Someone was taking people, and no one knew who. All the while, Michael Turner's shed remained unnoticed, sitting quietly in his backyard as police cars cruised past. The missing posters flapping on telephone poles grew weathered and torn by the wind, but the shed's door stayed firmly shut, hiding the answers that could have solved everything. Inside that small wooden structure, evidence of each disappearance was piling up in silence, but outside, life continued as though the shed was invisible. The neighbors who had once been so proud of their calm street were now afraid to linger outside after dusk. Families checked locks twice before going to bed, and every creak of the floor or rustle of leaves made hearts race. The disappearances had turned the neighborhood into a place of dread, yet the true source of the nightmare stood in plain sight, blending so perfectly into the scenery that nobody thought to question it. The morning the police arrived at Michael Turner's house, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet curiosity. It was not the kind of place where flashing lights and uniformed officers were a common sight. A few neighbors peered from behind curtains, while others stood cautiously at the edges of their lawns, pretending to check their mail or water plants just to watch. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, presenting their warrant and beginning a search of the property. From the outside, Turner's home looked no different from any other on the block, but the weight of suspicion had finally fallen upon it. Inside the house, investigators opened drawers, lifted mattresses, and combed through closets. They inspected the basement, knocking on the walls to check for hidden spaces, but found only the expected dust and old boxes. The garage was equally ordinary, filled with tools, paint cans, and stacks of firewood. Turner stood nearby, his expression carefully neutral, neither defensive nor overly friendly. To the officers, he appeared like any other resident unlucky enough to be pulled into a widening investigation. He had no record, no history of violence, and nothing unusual in his background. Eventually, their search led them into the backyard. The morning sun glared off the dew-soaked grass as the officers' boots crunched softly toward the old shed. Its weathered boards sagged slightly under years of exposure, and the rusted lock clicked open with minimal effort. For a moment, there was a hush, the kind that falls when something significant is about to be uncovered. The officers swung the door open and stepped inside, their flashlights cutting through the dim interior. The shed was cramped and cluttered, smelling faintly of earth and motor oil. Shelves lined the walls, crowded with dusty jars of nails, chipped paint cans, and tangled cords. A rusty wheelbarrow leaned in one corner, and a cracked plastic container spilled dried fertilizer across the floor. It looked exactly like the storage shed of any middle-aged homeowner. The officers moved slowly, shining their lights across every surface, taking notes, snapping photos. To them, it was an unremarkable space, untidy but harmless. What they could not see was the carefully constructed secret hidden beneath their feet. Under the worn floorboards lay a concealed hatch, perfectly disguised to blend with the warped wood. Beneath it stretched the chamber Turner had spent years creating, soundproof, reinforced, and invisible to any casual search. As the officers stood above it, their weight pressing down on the hollow floor, they were unknowingly only a few inches from the answers they had been searching for. Every missing person, every unsolved case was tied directly to what lay beneath them, but the design was flawless. Nothing in the shed gave away its true purpose. After a thorough inspection, the officers stepped back out into the sunlight. Their notes described the shed as ordinary, containing nothing of value to the case. They moved on, leaving Turner's backyard behind with no sense of the truth they had narrowly missed. From his porch, Turner watched them go, his posture calm, his expression unreadable. Relief washed over him silently, hidden beneath his controlled demeanor. The search had come as close as possible without uncovering his secret, and he knew the danger had passed. For now. That day would later haunt the investigation, a reminder of how thin the line had been between discovery and deception. The police had walked through the very heart of the mystery and left empty-handed, never realizing the floor beneath them was more than just old wood. It was the barrier that kept an entire nightmare hidden from view. Michael Turner's shed was more than a storage space. It was a project that had consumed him for years. From the outside, it appeared to be nothing more than a weathered wooden box, but beneath the peeling paint and sagging roof lay meticulous planning. Turner had studied blueprints, experimented with materials, and taken every precaution to ensure that what he built would remain invisible to anyone who entered. The false floor was his crowning achievement. At first glance, it looked like old wood, uneven and warped, but each board had been crafted and fitted to conceal the entrance beneath. The trapdoor blended so seamlessly that even trained investigators had walked over it without suspicion. The chamber below was nothing short of disturbing. Turner had dug it himself, night after night, carrying away soil in small amounts so neighbors wouldn't notice any sudden changes. The walls were lined with steel sheets to prevent collapse and wrapped with thick insulation to block all sound. Once completed, it resembled a bunker more than a basement, dark, airless, and impossible to detect without knowing exactly where to look. He had furnished it with objects that revealed its true purpose: restraints bolted into the concrete floor, a stained chair pushed against the wall, and shelves cluttered with tools that had no connection to gardening. The air smelled of damp earth and iron, a suffocating mixture that clung to everything inside. Over the years, the chamber became his hidden world. Every missing person from the neighborhood had passed through it, and the evidence of their final hours remained. Torn scraps of clothing, personal belongings, and items taken as trophies cluttered the room. To Turner, these objects were reminders of control, proof that his secret life was untouchable. He arranged them carefully, almost ritualistically, as if order would keep chaos from seeping into his carefully maintained exterior life. What made the chamber so chilling was not just what it contained, but how close it was to being discovered. When the police had entered the shed, their flashlights illuminated the shelves and floor, but none of them thought to stomp harder, to listen for the hollow echo beneath their boots. They had unknowingly stood directly above the chamber, their radios crackling, their pens scratching notes, while below them lay the evidence that would have solved every unanswered question. Turner, standing a few feet away outside, had kept his face still, his heart steady, as they unknowingly tested the limits of his disguise. Once the search was over and the officers left, Turner descended into the chamber again. He knew he had been close to exposure, but he also felt a renewed sense of power. The shed had worked exactly as he designed it to, convincing the police that it was ordinary, that it was nothing more than a container of forgotten junk. The hidden room remained untouched, silent in its secrecy. Turner sat in the chamber, staring at the trophies lined on the shelves, and allowed himself the smallest smile. He had outwitted them. The world above went on as usual, neighbors cutting their grass and children playing in driveways, while beneath the shed lay a darkness that no one had yet dared to see. It was months after the first search when Michael Turner's carefully constructed world began to unravel. His downfall did not come from suspicion about the disappearances, but from something entirely different. He had been caught shoplifting from a neighboring town, a petty act that seemed out of character for the quiet man. The incident drew unexpected attention, and when his fingerprints were run, they were flagged in connection with inconsistencies found during the earlier investigation into the missing residence. Suddenly, a man who had once been invisible was now under the full glare of scrutiny. This time, the police arrived differently. They came prepared with new warrants, fresh determination, and most importantly, cadaver dogs trained to detect what the human eye and ear could not. The search began the same way, with officers methodically combing through Turner's home, but the atmosphere was heavier, sharper. Neighbors gathered again at their windows and fences, whispering to one another with unease. Everyone sensed that this day was different, though none could predict just how far the darkness extended beneath that quiet backyard. When the officers reached the shed again, they opened the door without hesitation. Dust motes swirled in the stale air as the dogs were led inside. Unlike the officers from the first search, the animals were not fooled by the clutter of tools or the scattered paint cans. Their noses pressed to the ground, sniffing with restless urgency. One of them began to paw at a spot near the center of the floor. The sound of claws scraping against wood echoed in the cramped space, sharp and relentless. Then another dog joined in, both fixating on the same patch of floorboards. Handlers exchanged quick, grim glances. The officers moved swiftly. Crowbars were brought in, and the old boards groaned as they were pried apart. At first, the floor gave only splinters, but then a hollow thud rang out. Every ear in the shed caught the sound, a noise that shattered the illusion of ordinary storage. The boards were ripped away, revealing the hidden trapdoor, its edges stained with years of dust but unmistakably deliberate. When it was forced open, a wave of stale, suffocating air rushed upward, carrying with it the unmistakable odor of death. Flashlights flickered into the darkness below, exposing the chamber that Turner had believed would remain hidden forever. What the officers discovered was worse than any rumor the town had whispered. The chamber was lined with steel, its walls streaked with grime. Chains bolted into the floor gleamed faintly under the beams of light. A chair sat crooked in the corner, its cushions torn and stained. Along the shelves were trophies from the missing residents. Wallets, jewelry, shoes, each item a silent testament to the lives that had ended there. The chamber was not just a hidden room. It was a burial ground, a vault of terror concealed beneath the feet of investigators who had once walked across it, unaware. News of the discovery spread like wildfire. Residents who had once prided themselves on the safety of their street were confronted with the truth that horror had been living among them in plain sight. Families of the missing gathered outside the property, some collapsing in grief, others trembling with rage. Detectives who had worked the case for years stood hollow-eyed, realizing how close they had once been to solving everything. The most haunting detail, the one that none of them could shake, was the knowledge that they had already been inside that shed before. They had stood above the graves, their boots pressing against the floor, and had left believing it was nothing more than wood and dust. The failure lingered like a shadow over the investigation, a reminder of how easily evil can hide behind the ordinary when no one dares to look deeper.